Okay, now that you can draw Lewis structures, let's see what else you can do with them. Once you have a Lewis structure, you can apply Vsepr theory to it. That is valence shell electron pair repulsion theory, which sounds like a big giant mess, but you know what this means. First, valence shell. You know those are the outermost electrons in only the s and p orbitals. And then the second part, electron pair repulsion, you know that as well, that in a Lewis structure, electrons are in pairs and that they have to repel each other because they're negative, and negative things repel other negative things. Here's the technical definition of Vsepr theory, that lone pairs and bonds are made of electrons that repel each other and arrange themselves in a way so that they are as far apart as possible from the objects that they're repelled from. Pause for a second here. We know that things that repel each other would arrange themselves as far apart as possible. That's what it means when they repel each other. And what that does, though, is it determines how the bonds and lone pairs will arrange themselves around a central atom. Remember, we started figuring out which atom is central and attaching all the things to it. And now we're going to figure out what the three-dimensional shape is of that object in the end. There are two three-dimensional shapes that we're concerned with. One is the electron geometry, and that's where all the bonds and the lone pairs are. And then the other one is the molecular geometry, and that's just talking about where the atoms are. So if we take this example here of NH3, we know the Lewis structure, we're very familiar with that. Here is a bond, and here's a bond, and here's a bond, and here's a lone pair. And then here are your atoms. Your atoms are nitrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen, and hydrogen. So initially when you draw this, we drew it sort of like a T shape. But it turns out when you have four things, so 1, 2, 3, 4, as far apart as they can get off your center is not going to be that T shape, because that T shape is a 90-degree angle. And we can do better than a 90-degree angle. Also, we didn't indicate that that lone pair is also repelling things. So as far apart as possible for four things turns out to make this kind of tetrahedral shape, where you've got a lone pair on top, and then these three things coming out at kind of different angles. Well, actually, they're all the same angle. All the angles are 109.5 degrees, which is bigger than 90, and not quite 180, which would be like a straight line. The electron geometry here has a name. It's called tetrahedral. And we want to worry about not just the electron geometry, but also the molecular geometry. Remember, the molecular geometry is where the atoms are. So here are our atoms, and they don't quite make that same tetrahedral shape. In fact, they only make the bottom part of that tetrahedral shape. And that is called trigonal pyramid. And we're going to build these models in class so you can see them a little bit better. My 3D pictures probably don't quite do it justice. We're also going to look at a computer simulation so you can see these three-dimensional models as well. Let's make sure you're looking at this page in your reference packet while you do this. It's an excellent reference and makes it so there's very little you have to memorize. First of all, there's a key down at the bottom. It tells you that this name at the bottom of all these shapes is called the molecular geometry. It points out what lone pairs look like. You're pretty familiar with those so far. It also shows you bonded atoms, that those are going to be the straight lines attached to the sphere at the end. And then there's a key for a formula, which we don't have to worry a whole lot about, but that's there if you need it. Okay, and then the electron geometries are all listed up here at the top of each column. So let's look at an example. So for the example that we just did, we were looking at something that looked like this. We had 3 atoms coming off the central atom, so those 3 green spheres, and then the central atom also had a lone pair. So it looks most like this one. It couldn't be, for example, this one, because it only has 2 atoms coming off the central atom. It couldn't be this one because there are 4 atoms coming off the central atom, and also the central atom has no lone pairs. Could not be this one because the central atom only has 2 atoms coming off and also has 2 lone pairs. So we know it has to be the trigonal pyramid one. That's the molecular geometry. And then if you look straight up at the top, it's a tetrahedral electron geometry. The electron geometries are listed up here at the top. So it says tetrahedral tells you there are 4 things around the central atom, a lone pair and 3 bonds, and then the shape that the atoms are making, they make a trigonal pyramid. Okay, let's draw some Lewis dot structures. Let's start with HF. Hydrogen has 1 valence electron, fluorine has 7 valence electrons. Together, that gives us 1 plus 7. We've got 8 to work with. There's not really a central atom in this, and once you single bond it, you've used up 2 out of your 8. So the 6 that you have left go around the fluorine because hydrogen can't have anything around it. When you look at these, it doesn't look a ton like any of the ones in the picture, but all that you can do with 2 atoms is make a straight line. That makes it linear. And again, I know it's really only this part of the linear, but that's all you can do with 2 atoms. That makes the molecular geometry linear and also the electron geometry linear. Okay, that was such an easy example that it's almost a little bit confusing, so let's try another one. Why don't you pause the video for a second and see if you can draw the Lewis dot structure for NF3. Hopefully you have something that looks like this. Each of the fluorines has 3 lone pairs. The nitrogen, your central atom, has 1 lone pair and 3 bonds to it. So now what we want to do is look at this central atom and figure out which one of the pictures looks most like it. You've got 3 bonds coming off of it and a lone pair. So that's what we're looking for. So we need 3 bonds. If I look at this one, I'm like, ooh, 3 bonds, but it doesn't have a lone pair, so not that one. This one has 2 bonds. It has a lone pair, but if we look one over, we've got 3 bonds and a lone pair. That makes it trigonal pyramid for the molecular geometry. And if we look up at the top, tetrahedral for the electron geometry. The electron geometry, again, is because on that central atom, you have 4 things trying to get as far away as possible. You've got the lone pair, which is trying to push itself away from all of those bonds. So in order to get as far apart as possible, they're going to arrange themselves all at an angle of 109.5 degrees. Okay, pause the video for a second and try drawing the last 2 Lewis dot structures. Okay, I bet at least the one for water you have memorized at this point. So let's use our diagram and see if we can figure out what the electron and molecular geometries are for these last 2 Lewis dot structures. Okay, so let's focus on the central atom in CH4. It has 4 bonded atoms. 1, 2, 3, 4, so 4 bonds around it. And when we look at the reference materials, the only thing that has 4 bonded atoms to it and no lone pairs on the central atom is this one. Notice it's called tetrahedral, and the electron geometry is also tetrahedral. In fact, if you look at all these columns, the electron geometry matches the molecular geometry for the first row. So all along this first row, those match. That's because none of the ones in the first row have any lone pairs on the central atom, meaning all the things that are trying to repel each other are also bonds which end in an atom. The electron and molecular geometry, the difference between them is one is just where the electrons are and the other one is where the atoms are. If every set of electrons ends in an atom, then they should be the same. The problem is some sets of electrons don't end in an atom because they're lone pairs. They still repel everything, but they don't have an atom attached to the end of them, which means they're affecting the shape, but they're invisible because we can see atoms. I mean, we can't see them with our eyes, but with very specialized microscopes. But we can't see electrons. They're too small. But we can see that atoms are pushed away because of the presence of electrons. And that's why you see the special shape that water gets. And often even the Lewis dot structure for water, you've seen it drawn this way. And that's because it truly is a bent shape for where the atoms are. And that's because the lone pairs are repelling the bonds. If you look on this diagram, the shape for water is this one. It is bent with 2 lone pairs and 2 bonds. And the electron geometry is tetrahedral because there really are 4 things that are repelling each other. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's the tetrahedral shape. It just turns out that out of those 4 things, 2 of them are lone pairs, so the shape that the atoms make is just bent.